And then the Democrats, the Democrats actually accomplished many things that are worse than the Republicans, but they do so. I love the line by Bill Clinton when he said, "I feel your pain." And remember, it was Clinton et al. Who passed NAFTA.
Right.
And, I got a real education on this back in the late 80s, early 90s, when George Bush the First made this big deal that he wanted to gut the Endangered Species Act. And there was just this huge outcry among environmentalists. No, 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 don't touch that sacred piece of legislation. And so he couldn't touch it. And then all Clinton did was defund a lot of the programs associated with the Endangered Species Act. He never said a word. But at the same time, we got to save the natural world, we got to do all this stuff. Meanwhile, he's defunding the programs and caused far more harm than Bush the First ever did to it. And Obama has been a complete disaster for the natural world. Of course, Bush was. Of course, Clinton was. So on the national level, I don't. Just the whole system is entirely corrupt and needs to go. No, it's not corrupt. It's accomplishing exactly what it's supposed to accomplish, which is the privatization of profits and the externalization of costs.
Which you talk about in, I think it might have been Endgame Volume 2, where you discuss the Forest Service and the fact that they don't enforce the laws that they have regarding trails and trail usage and that sort of thing. Don't really know where I'm going with that, but
Well, that's part of the problem too. I mean, there are plenty of decent laws on the books, including laws like against rape.
Right.
But so far as rape, only 6% of rapists spend even one night in jail, and that's something that is as open and shut as that. There was when I lived in northeastern Washington, I was a forest activist, and we were able to shut down the entire timber sale programs in the national forest simply by forcing the national forest to enforce the laws. The laws are already on the books, and they couldn't put out their timber sales. So what they did then is this is happening all over the country with activists. It wasn't just us. What they did is they got they called the salvage rider that basically for any timber sales they wanted to put out, they could just put a few magic words on them, and this was passed through Congress that in Clinton's time. Clinton signed it. When Al Gore, Mr. Environmental, was vice president, and allowed them to put out all these timber sales that were illegal by just making a law saying they could put them out. And what that taught me, among other things, was that any time you figure out how to use their rules to stop the destruction, they just change the rules.
Yeah, and it just reminds me of a large part of how the Nazis were able to do what they were able to do, which was, again, it's the same thing, simply changing the laws to make sterilization of people legal, and then to make segregation of people legal, and it's a very similar system.
But we need to never forget that laws are more or less, laws are just essentially rules made by rich people and enforced by employees of the rich people, by which I mean the police. Once again, that's not to say, and anarchists get mad at me for this, but anarchists get mad at me for everything. That's not to say that we don't need laws against rape. What I'm saying is that we need to recognize that laws are essentially made by and for those in power. Apartheid was legal. And as you said, within Nazi Germany, a lot of that behavior was completely legal according to the laws.
Right. So we obviously know what's going to happen as far as the Keystone Pipeline goes if Mitt Romney is elected. What do you think will happen with Keystone if Obama is granted a second term?
Oh, I think it'll go through. I don't think there's any doubt on that.
Did you ever have doubts about it?
Ever have doubts about what he would do on that?
Yeah.
No. I haven't always. I was when I was 19. I voted for Ronald Reagan, and the reason I voted for Ronald Reagan is because he said he was going to balance the budget. That was a big part of his campaign, and the corporate news media said that was really important to balance the budget. Whatever. So I voted for him, and then Of course, he didn't balance the budget, but ran huge deficits. And the point is that there was no accountability. Nobody ever said, hey, he said he was going to balance the budget. So I know that this sounds naive and silly, but when I was 19, I didn't understand yet that politicians routinely lie.
Right.
And they do. I mean, they'll say whatever it takes to get elected, and then they're just going to serve the corporations anyway. I mean, Obama has been just terrible environmentally. He's been terrible on, he's been terrible on human rights. He's expanded use of drones. He's been. I can go on and on with all the things. He made this big deal and I'm just mentioning this because once again I live in California, and so I happen to know this, that he made a big deal that he wasn't going to go after the dispensaries and the marijuana dispensaries in California, and he's actually they've gone after dispensaries a lot more than George Bush ever did. So I don't, he seems much more personable, but the question is, do you want to deal with the good cop or the bad cop? In any case, the work's going to get done for the corporations. That's the bottom line.
And you did an interview during the Bush-Kerry elections with the LA independent media, and they asked you a question which I thought was really interesting as to whether or not it might not be better, from your point of view, to vote for George Bush because it would possibly cause a faster, systematic collapse of civilization. The same sort of question, I think, could be asked about Mitt Romney. And what do you think about that question?
Well, I'm guessing that the way I answered then is probably the way I'll answer now, and that's I don't think. I mean, given the point, I believe, is to bring down the current exploitative system, causing as little damage to the rest of the world as possible. There's an image someone gave me 20 years ago or 25 years ago, which was that when you demolish a building in a city, what you want to do is demolish it so it falls in place and doesn't take out all the other buildings, like if you have a planned demolition. And so we don't actually want to increase unbridled exploitation because that will cause more damage in the meantime. I think one of the things we want to do, it's like a friend of mine says that he's an environmentalist, and he says the reason that he does his work, which is trying to protect different places, is because as things become increasingly chaotic, he wants to make sure that some doors remain open. And what he means by that is if he can do whatever he can, this is so true of so many environmentalists I know, we're basically just holding on, trying to protect this or that piece of ground until the economic system grinds to a halt. And because if grizzly bears are still alive in 10 years, they may be alive in 100, but if they're gone in 10, they're gone forever.
Right.
And so as long as this system is still in place, I'm really in favor of trying to do whatever we can to, A, bring it down quicker, and B, prepare local communities, which includes non-human members of our communities, absolutely, for that crash. So one of the things I always say is that, or one of the things I talk about is as economic systems collapse, men's violence against women increases. And so we need to not just pretend that's not going to happen, but we need to prepare for that. And the way that women, I think, need to prepare for that is by learning self-defense now. And the way I think men need to prepare for that is by making our allegiance to women absolute and to having a zero-tolerance policy for men's violence against women, and to emplace that now. And the reason I bring all this up is because I think the same is absolutely true for white violence against people of color. I think the same thing is true for defense of the land. We need to make our allegiance to the land absolute, and our allegiance to women absolute, our allegiance to other victims of this culture, people of color, absolute. And then we need to make decisions. I mean, okay, so are you going to vote? Sure, no, whatever. And then how do you determine that? And I think part of it for me is, my allegiance to the victims of the culture helps determine whether and for whom I would vote in anything from a local to a larger scale election, and also whether I will vote, and also whether, what other forms my activism takes. And I just want to be really clear again that one of the problems with electoral politics is that it can substitute for the real work of organization. That's one of the brilliant parts of this, of this from the perspective of those in power, is that they co-opt all this tremendous energy that could be used for some form or another of more or less effective activism, and it gets co-opted into, working for Obama because there's some hope and change or something. And that's a tremendous drain of energy that could have been used to actually attempt to affect some real change. I don't have a problem. I actually don't care. I don't care if somebody votes or not. I mean, whether you go and actually walk into the ballot place and do something, I don't care whether somebody does that any more than I care whether they watch, the baseball game tonight. That's completely, on a larger scale, I think it's completely irrelevant to what happens. But don't let that keep you, whatever you decide to do, don't let that keep you from doing other work that can actually provide tangible benefit for women, for people of color, for the poor, for the natural world.